Welcome back to Sociology 227. This is David Harvey, video 2. I've got 3 goals in this video. First, we're going to look through Harvey's argument about accumulation by dispossession, and I'll give you some more recent examples. Next, I want to theorize neoliberalism more generally, looking to some of the stuff we did in Sociology 226. Finally, I'm going to get you ready to do your 2-paragraph response. Let's go. Key to David Harvey's formulation of neoliberalism is Marx's notion of the so-called primitive accumulation. This is the process through which things that were not themselves commodities came to be exchanged as such. I had previously used the example of colonialism and the sale of land to make this apparent. With the European colonial project, land that did not have a value in Canada was given one. Treaties were signed and agreements were made that gave land a value. This very often violent process of accumulation was one where capitalism was extended to places where it did not exist before. Harvey extends Marx's understanding of the so-called primitive accumulation to address the ways in which capitalist societies further introduce the commodity form into the way that value circulates. That is, Harvey is not only talking about giving particular things a value, but in new forms of valuation that emerge in capitalist life. This can take numerous forms. It can refer to particular commodities that are bundles of other commodities, as in something like mutual funds. Or it can refer to something like taking an asset that is owned by the public sphere and bringing it to the private sector. Think of something like the sale of a public corporation or a public-private partnership. Here we find new forms of valuation and opportunities for profit extracted from an existing entity. Another great example, and this occurs throughout the United States, would be a private prison. Accumulation by dispossession ultimately means doubling the same process that Marx was writing about in Capital. This should make the historical argument clear. Though so-called primitive accumulation continues, accumulation by dispossession is a secondary step in the same process. Harvey is simply illustrating a derivative process of something highlighted by Marx all those years ago. The first form of accumulation by dispossession is privatization. Obviously, you all know about the first form of accumulation by dispossession, privatization. That would be the act of taking a publicly owned or state-run entity and selling it off for a short-term profit. This is precisely what happened in terms of the sale of Hydro Ontario, as pictured in this beautiful diagram I stole from their website. Privatization, as the sale of state assets, is quite important in sociological theorizations of neoliberalism. Equally important, however, are the justifications for why. In many cases, the argument is that the government can't do the dirty work that the private sector can, given that public employees are generally paid more, unionized, etc. The private sector is leaner, meaner, and so on and so forth, and can deliver the job at a much lower cost than the public can. It is in our welfare, therefore, to get rid of our stuff. Here I would note that privatization refers to both the sale of public assets as well as the general tendency to look to the private sector for solutions to hitherto public problems. This could mean subcontracting out medical services to a third party, as we often do in Canada. Go to the hospital and look who's working there. You'll see cleaning crews, security guards, patient transfer professionals, many of them working in the healthcare sector, but off the public purse. The second form is financialization. That there's a photo of Yanis Varoufakis, the former Greek finance minister and economist, and according to the Eurogroup, not such a great negotiator. The third aspect highlighted by Harvey brings us close to the creative destruction that Schumpeter talked about in the last video. While Schumpeter was talking about the mechanisms through which innovation keeps capitalism going, Harvey is discussing the various ways that powerful classes are able to consolidate their class positions in times of upheaval. Like right now. In the piece, written in 2007, Harvey is emphasizing the ways in which global financial crises are places where powerful people can gain quite a bit of money on the misfortune of others. He is particularly emphatic that groups like the World Bank and International Monetary Fund impose conditions that are friendlier to rescuing investors than to those who are experiencing financial crises through structural adjustment policies. We'll address this in greater detail during Post-Colonialism Week. What I want to highlight are domestic ways this happens as well. Say, what happened a year after Harvey wrote the piece? It was the global financial crisis of 2008. And what happened after that? Yes, while a great many people lost their houses, There were minor fines given to banking institutions, and, well, capitalism continued unfettered. What Harvey is indicating is that when creative destruction, or crises, both are great opportunities to make some bank, continue, the gains from them are distributed exactly as Marx predicted. Finally, state redistributions. We can all think of one kind of redistribution that Harvey is talking about: tax cuts. This is the basis of neoliberalism, at least as it's defined by Harvey here, extending market access to all. Taxes are seen as a bulwark to this, diverting money to wasteful governments rather than to the justice of the market. But aside from tax cuts, what I want to emphasize here are how there are other mechanisms through which government policy benefits the upper classes in ways that are less explicit. Here I've placed a picture of Julian Fantino, who, 2 jobs ago, was the OPP commissioner, 1 job ago, a conservative MP and cabinet minister, and then sat on the board for a cannabis company that made a great deal of money during the current legalization regime. With influence, Fantino was able to place himself in the way of a great deal of profit with the legalization of marijuana. The neoliberal regime allows upper classes access to the profitability from state redistributions. Tax cuts, or marijuana legalization, or private prisons, or whatever, the particular industry or issue is less important than the main principle. Harvey says that Marx gives us the tools, not the technique, but the tools to analyze the contemporary changes in capitalism. We can call this advanced liberalism, late capitalism, or neoliberalism, or whatever we want. But, at the end of the day, Marx was right. Let's switch gears and theorize neoliberalism more generally. One of the other important transformations in the neoliberal context has to do with the way that existing market actors have changed their operation in light of challenges by other competitors. Let's think about the airline industry. Consider the example of Ryanair. It costs you £10 to pick your seat beforehand, £10 to pay by credit card, and so on. But the flights are really cheap. We can see a general trend of flight carriers with plenty of competition moving to super low fares, but also charging for extras. With these forms of competition, we also see generally depressed wages for workers in the industry. This, in kind, causes other competitors to look for ways to reduce costs, and the move away from unionized workplaces. So, for other companies like Air Canada, the market dictates particular business moves. When we talk about neoliberalism, we have to consider the ways that market competition, as a governmental goal, changes the ways that various markets operate and the way that we, as consumers, operate within them. David Harvey is going to say this is universally bad, but consider the ways in which each of us participates in the same sort of decision making. If you can fly for $18 versus $80, you're likely going to do so once you consider the extras that you're going to have to buy or avoid. Here then we have an element that Harvey doesn't talk about in this article: how we actively accept the tenets of neoliberal practice. I want to emphasize the 2 ways in which neoliberalism shapes economic practices. It shapes both the ways in which markets are organized and the ways that people orient their personal practices within them. In the article, you see a lot more of one than the other, but a complete sociology of neoliberalism should emphasize these 2 poles. On the one hand, then, we have changing market dynamics whereby airlines must be more competitive. On the other hand, neoliberalism is a condition whereby that competition shapes the choices that we make in market spaces. Here the sociological story is about following people around and seeing how new economic circumstances alter existing social structures. Have you guys heard about Amazon.com? It's another good example. These guys, as you might know, make a buttload of money, selling $96.1 billion worth of stuff and services in the 3rd quarter of 2020 alone. What I want to do is show you, just like in the case of airline restructuring, that Amazon is the neoliberal economy par excellence. First of all, what's it like to work at Amazon? What type of jobs are people fulfilling for the company or other companies that provide services for Amazon? Let's think this through. Whereas traditional post-war workplaces tended to have employees working full-time at a fixed location, Amazon's workers tend to be employed on an on-demand basis. Also, there's the role of automation. What makes Amazon's stuff so much more affordable than others is the way that the company uses technology alongside the flexible workers. If anyone or anything can be replaced by a machine for less than they're paid, they are. Humans are assigned tasks that computers can't do for less. This is the basis of the business model. Finally, are Amazon's labor practices. Whereas in the industrial economic age, workers tend to be located in a single space and unionized, Amazon's workers are globally distributed and are not unionized at all. So, we can say that Amazon's new working conditions are casual, not full-time, automated whenever possible, and dispersed in terms of labor organization and global location. What I want to argue is that Amazon is not an exception in today's economic climate. It is the business that others look to for guidance. We can also think about Amazon and new commodity relations. Let's think about the various ways that Amazon organizes the marketplace, the distribution of goods, and the way you pay for items or services that you decide to buy. Think also about the kind of infrastructure that Amazon maintains. Mailing people the stuff they buy within a day is one of the mechanisms Amazon uses to distribute stuff. But that's not all the company offers. In fact, Amazon loses money in most of the items they ship when they're shipped for free. Amazon doesn't just deliver stuff, but they are also in the data business. This is crucial. All of the work you do when shopping is very carefully tracked, both for advertisements and to sell to other companies. Amazon is also in the hosting business, using its servers to store other companies' stuff. You'd be surprised how many places have their data stored on Amazon servers. And Amazon has a notorious workplace platform, Amazon Mechanical Turk, or MTurk, where people bid on jobs to be performed in a task-by-task fashion, like sorting images, entering data, and so on. In these ways, Amazon makes information and information storage a commodity and hires people in a piece-by-piece fashion for this model. Finally, think about Amazon and market relations. I can't overemphasize the role that finance plays in Amazon's business practices. Here you can see the stock valuation for the company from yesterday. Amazon, like many giant tech companies, is a publicly traded entity designed solely to drive up stock prices and create shareholder value. While lots of companies have been public in the past and will be in the future, Amazon's model is growth first, meaning that they're willing to take a loss on services in the aims of creating higher and higher shareholder values. This is financialization at its best, or worst, depending on who you ask. I want to end this lecture talking about the component Harvey doesn't in the readings, how we shape ourselves within the neoliberal economy. Let's talk about the significant impact that neoliberalism has had on interpersonal relations and interaction. I don't need to tell you about the ways in which the sharing economy has significantly changed market organization in this country and across the world. We have plenty of newspaper stories about cab strikes to address the market transformations of Uber, hotels lobbying the government to deal with the Airbnb issue, etc. Here we can tell a pretty clear-cut story of creative destruction. That is, new forms of innovation disrupting the economic status quo. What I want to emphasize here is the methods in which we incorporate parts of the neoliberal sharing economy into our everyday lives, and how the individual attachments that we have to people and things change. Here I think the case of Airbnb is particularly interesting, as the social relations that surround it are totally distinct from those of staying in hotels. As an aside, I wonder if it'll even exist a year from now. Obviously, the Airbnb market has altered real estate, with landlords opting for short-term rentals at the expense of longer-term ones. At least before COVID. But we can also see a change in moral attachments in terms of clients and service providers. One can stay in an Airbnb without making any personal contact with the host, and appealing to the company rather than the operator in cases where things go wrong. Those businesses providing customer service also need to change their business practices to the new responsiveness expected of them by service users. Here, neoliberalism isn't solely something imposed on mom-and-pop shops by shadowy board members, as much as it is a technologically mediated market space, shaping social relations. Here I think we need to look to a wider cast of characters than just Karl Marx. Yeah, there's a Karl Marx story going on here where labor is alienated and social relations are shaped into the commodity form. Now, we can debate whether or not that's a good or bad thing, but the commodity form it is. But there is more to this story than only a top-down one imposing market spaces where they didn't exist before. We also have a Max Weber story about instrumental rationalities and subjects making economic decisions based on their institutional circumstances. We have a Michel Foucault story of economics shaping institutions and industries and individuals shaping themselves in those spaces. Think about Yelp reviews or rating Ubers, etc. These are all technologies where we make ourselves into neoliberal citizens. And ultimately, I think there is a Durkheim story about how moral attachments are shaped in new forms of the division of labor. They can be for good or for ill, but the neoliberal space isn't solely one imposed on people, but is an active agent of socialization, as is the case with any other kind of social fact. Okay, it's your turn. In 2 paragraphs between 5 to 8 sentences in length, and with reference to the readings. 1. Explain the difference between the neoliberal economy and the early industrial capitalist economy. Secondly, use an example of a company that currently exists, not covered in this lecture, to make those differences apparent.